Greetings and welcome. My name is Richard Francis. I'm co-chairing, co-hosting this session on behalf of IWA and GGGI. We welcome everybody who's part of it. We welcome our speakers. We thank very much FSM 6 for organising it and giving us this platform, and for doing an awful lot of work in the background to make sure the systems work. We are talking about regulating fecal sludge management through roles and responsibilities, regulations and standards. And we have an interesting session, I believe, to see a very particular case study from Senegal. Wrapped around it is this sort of bigger issue of how we regulate, how this tool of regulation might be able to help us accelerate good fecal sludge management services to everybody. And so there's a little bit of an introduction from myself on behalf of the IWA pattern. Then we will be focusing upon the Senegal case study for half an hour. Then back to the IWA aspect, and that will be a conversation between myself and Kariuki Mugo from Wasup in Kenya. And then we'll bring ourselves all back together for a panel discussion. And very much we're hoping for comments and questions from our participants. And therefore, please do use the chat session to put in any questions you might have or comments you might have. And we'll try and make sure we catch up on those as we go along. This is the brief that we put into the program for the conference, looking at roles and responsibilities, regulations and regulating. This sort of whole context and concept, which has become a little bit fashionable recently, and we'll try and explore later on why that might be, with a particular focus on the development through this first-hand account by stakeholders of the Senegalese standard on fecal sludge containment, but then to go on and explore how regulations and standards fit into the overall pattern of regulating. Many countries have had standards for a long, long time, but never seem to implement them. And we are concerned and want to explore how that might happen. On behalf of IWA, I'm speaking for the citywide inclusive sanitation regulating program. It's available online. And we have been preparing a call for action for regulators, particularly to enable them to think about non-sewage sanitation as well as sewered sanitation. And I'm very pleased to be joined by one of the advisory board members of that task force group, Kariuki Mugo, who is WSUP Director of WASH Support globally, but based in Kenya. My name is Richard Francis, and I'm a consultant now, ex-academic, or past academic, supporting IWA in this. And I started off the call to action by saying the question we face is how to square the circle. Now, it might be a very English idiom, this, but how to square a circle is something defined as doing something very difficult or maybe impossible, because our challenge to get sanitation in urban areas to everybody by 2030 is really, really challenging, very, very difficult. We trust it's not impossible, but we have to be aware of those challenges. And so citywide inclusive sanitation, a public service approach is the phraseology used. Might discuss that later with Mugo. Planning and implementing sewered and non-sewered sanitation, when the estimated cost is $100 billion a year, every year, and when willingness to pay is very limited, taxation rates are too low, and donor transfers are not increasing. These are the challenges. So we wonder whether CWIS needs regulators, because regulators have the expertise of finding the pragmatic balance. We had to use that phrase very carefully. We talked about compromise at one time in writing this document. Pragmatic balance for reality of getting the balance between policy and standards set by policymakers and legislatures and the service providers, and how they access the necessary funding, the tariffs and taxes, for repayable financing and the human resources to deliver the service. regulating has a challenge as a policy intervention. We've seen that regulators in some countries, fairly new entities in many countries, have found a way to nudge forwards the monopoly piped water supply sector. And there's exciting things. It really is making a difference in some countries, particularly the concept of league tables between utilities, incentivizing performance. And now we have to ask whether these water supply regulators can take their skills, the art of their compromising, and extend it from monopoly piped water through monopoly piped sewerage to maybe non-networked, not a monopoly, fecal sludge management, and the emptying and conveyance, maybe monopoly treatment still. Quite a challenge. And in times past, I've suggested it might be an order of magnitude more complex in regulatory terms to regulate FSM compared with where, with respect, regulators have so far failed to regulate sewerage in the most part. A call to action to get things to work. Every country has its own approach. Senegal is very different from Kenya, is very difficult from all the other countries in the case studies we've looked at. There is no one size fits all, no best approach. But there is this concept of somebody to audit what is going on, to benchmark between providers, to understand the real costs, and to begin to get a better understanding of the tariffs or taxes which are required to support non-sewered sanitation as well as sewered. And so we have this call from IWA point of view to support and inspire economic regulators to catalyse service delivery. That's the task being given to this fairly new institutional entity in many countries. And to put this in a context, we see that we have to split out roles and responsibilities, regulations and standards, and regulating the process of making it work. Roles and responsibilities you can see on this slide, the governance enabling environment, all the various entities. Are all the activities and tasks being covered, or are there any gaps? And if we do have regulators, for example, how independent are they? If we have municipalities who have been responsible, are they doing their job? And to define which institutional stakeholder is doing or should be doing what in delivering the progressive realization of the human right to sanitation. Regulators can't do it all on their own. They work within this stakeholder enabling environment. But to do that, they need the regulations. The case study from Senegal we look at particularly focuses on this. I once lived in Juba in South Sudan, and there the old standard was that pit latrines had to be 3 meters deep, a standard brought in from other countries, cut and paste. Unfortunately, you hit the hard rock at 1 meter down, so nobody could deliver that in an affordable manner. Regulations have to be there, but have to be realistic. What are the wastewater treatment standards, or how often should septic tanks be emptied, for example? And the IWA case studies suggest that every 2 years there should be ensuring septic tanks are emptied, desludged, we could better put it. What are the operating procedures for sanitation workers? So these regulations are utterly critical as the basis for regulating the ongoing process of managing the delivery of the regulations, balancing private affordability and willingness to pay against the tariffs and charges for financiability and the delivery efficiency of public investments. Too many words wrapped up in there, but regulating is a process. Who keeps it going? Not just the things which are on paper, the policies and the standards, but actually nudges everybody to deliver. Regulating, I sometimes say, is not so much about protecting the consumer, but we often think that. It's about protecting the service provider to enable them to ensure they can get the funding and tariffs or taxes necessary to do their job. So regulating is there to protect the service provider from the failures of government very often, as well as to protect the consumer. And I suggest at the end of this slide, it will not be possible to square the circle of sanitation delivery by 2030 without very creative, adaptive, realistic regulating support to enable service providers. We sometimes use the analogy that a regulator is like a referee in a football match. The teams are government and policymakers, and the other team is service providers. The citizen customers are the crowd watching the football match. What we need is the referee to make sure the laws of the game are being followed in order to keep the game going, so we can get maybe a 3 goals each score draw. The problem of this analogy is now we have the assistant referee by television who is getting so precise, the whistle perhaps is being blown too often. And the art of regulating, we would say, is to not blow the whistle too often, have the standards, but keep the game flowing, empowering the process. If we are too exact too soon, we are lost. And this is my diagram I like to see, taken from the World Bank's accountability triangle, but where the regulating system fits in. And I tend to focus too much on economic regulators, but there are, of course, environmental regulators, water and wastewater quality regulators as well. Whether it is a public or private service provider, somebody needs to be ensuring the goals are being achieved. Perhaps we'll come back to that. And a quote from a regulator, just before we hand over to Senegal: the approach that the regulator wants to take is, on one hand, we push that pace for extra financing of sanitation. But on the other hand, we also push from the standards and regulations point of view. For example, individuals construct their houses to make sure they do this properly. When you're dealing with regulation, it's so dynamic a process. It's changing all the time. You just need to keep in there. So that's one critical lesson that we have learned as a regulator speaking, that you can't really say that you have mastered it all. It's always learning, always adapting, always moving things forward. The Iwa case studies, these 3 groups, will form the basis of a conversation between Mugo and myself later on. Senegal is one of the case studies in our IWA approach, and we are now going to move across to GGGI to take over and introduce their case study on standards and regulations, the foundation of regulating. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I'm accompanied here by the GGGI team in Senegal. So Romain Brier, the country representative of Senegal, Abdoulaye Faye, the project manager for GGI in Senegal, but also the Director of Sanitation in the Ministry of Water, Supply and Sanitation, Omar Sene, who was recently nominated by the President himself of Senegal as the Director, and also the Director of the Senegal Norm Association, Abdourahmane Ndion. So this intervention will be mainly for the speakers from Senegal to explain a little bit about this new norm. But before I bring in the 2 speakers from Senegal, I'm going to just give a little bit of background of how we came about this. So GGI is the Global Green Growth Institute. We're an intergovernmental organization headquartered in Seoul, currently over 38 members, we're still growing. The particularity of our organization is that in host countries, we're embedded within ministries. So often it's the Ministry of Environment. So under the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation project in Senegal, we aim to cover 3 areas to accomplish green citywide inclusive sanitation. And we looked at policy, investment and generating evidences around the linkage between sanitation and climate change. So the policy, all three elements are interlinked, and the idea is by having sufficient policy elements in place, so looking at containment, but also treatment and reuse, that we can then attract climate finance and build a sustainable business model. So this is what we aim to do, and we start in 2019, and the policy elements have been successful so far. And one of them was supporting ISN in developing this containment norm. So discussing with ISN, we realized that there were international norms that were developed, but there was a need to protect populations from contamination of their water resources, but also to provide stable volumes for the fecal sludge business models, because currently these containments were oftentimes built to leak so that they wouldn't have to empty. So I'm going to bring in the two speakers, Omar Sene and Abdulrahman Dion, and I have some questions for them. So for the Director of Sanitation, Omar Sene, Omar is going to intervene in French. I'm going to ask the question in English, and our country representative, Omar, will kindly translate into English. So what are the current needs for norms and regulation for FSM in Senegal? Thank you, Omar.
Merci. Vous pouvez traduire en français, s'il vous plaît? My English is not very good.
Yes. Romain, could I ask you? Yes, thank you.
Bonjour, monsieur le directeur de l'assainissement. Quels sont aujourd'hui les besoins ou les besoins pour une norme en matière d'assainissement au Sénégal?
Voilà, merci Romain, merci à tous. Je voudrais aussi signaler qu'il y a un de mes collaborateurs, en l'occurrence M. Sek et Mme Sen, Dabasen, qui est le chef de la division régionale de l'assainissement de Dakar, qui participe aussi à cette séance. Donc, Mme Sek ayant des soucis par rapport à sa machine est en train de suivre avec Sek. Voilà. Merci de nous avoir associés à cette rencontre pour réfléchir, discuter, échanger sur les questions de normalisation au Sénégal dans le sous-secteur de l'assainissement. La question par rapport à, disons, aux besoins que nous avons au niveau du sous-secteur en termes de normalisation. Aujourd'hui, si vous voyez la norme qui a été conçue, donc c'est une norme qui concerne les ouvrages d'assainissement autonome et particulièrement les ouvrages de confinement. Ce qui fait qu'il y a toute une partie de la chaîne de valeur de l'assainissement autonome qui n'est pas encore normée, notamment pour ce qui est des autres maillons, en l'occurrence le transport, mais aussi l'élimination et la réutilisation donc, des boues. Donc ça, c'est un besoin par rapport donc, à la norme. L'autre aspect aussi, c'est qu'il y a un besoin de renforcement de capacité également au niveau non seulement de notre secteur, le personnel disons, du ministère, notamment de la direction de l'assainissement, mais aussi tous les acteurs qui gravitent autour de l'assainissement autonome et qui aujourd'hui est en train d'être, en tout cas, développé au Sénégal à travers un certain nombre donc, de projets. L'autre élément, notamment, c'est vraiment la vulgarisation, n'est-ce pas, non seulement de cette norme, mais aussi des autres normes, comme la norme ISO 24521, la norme 30500 également, qui sont des normes qui ne sont pas très bien connues par certains acteurs du sous-secteur. Et de ce point de vue-là, nous avons besoin également qu'il y ait en tout cas une session, disons, de vulgarisation en dehors du renforcement de capacité dont je viens de parler. Alors, un aspect important qui a été proposé qui m'a été signalé par Mme Sen, c'est vraiment que les aspects qui sont, les exigences qui sont indiquées dans cette norme-là, ces exigences-là puissent être intégrées dans les curricula des écoles de formation, notamment dans la formation professionnelle, pour tout ce qui est génie civil. Parce qu'il y a un certain nombre de formations qui sont dispensées en génie civil. Et ce serait important que tous ces éléments-là, qui sont relatifs à cette norme-là, puissent être intégrés donc, dans ce circuit-là. Il y a aussi un autre élément qui me semble important, et je pense que c'est un focus. C'est vraiment sur... c'est vrai au niveau de la vidange, on l'a dit, mais également, tout à l'heure, j'ai parlé du transport de la vidange, du transport de la réutilisation. Je pense que c'est une répétition peut-être. Voilà quelques éléments, je pense, de besoins que je voulais partager. Et je peux aussi, si vous le permettez, demander à mes collaborateurs s'ils ont également quelque chose à dire par rapport à ça. Madame Sen, c'est si vous avez à ajouter. Madame Sen, donc c'est bon, hein?
Oui, ok.
Alors,
oui.
C'est bon, hein, madame?
C'est bon, directeur. Voilà. La réponse à mon niveau, elle est complète. Merci.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'll be translating on behalf of Mr. Sen. So about this first question about the current needs for norms and regulation of Senegal, the first point that Mr. Sen made here, he just welcomed two of his collaborators, which are also working with the Ministry of Water and Sanitation in Senegal, Mr. Sek and Mrs. Sen, which is why he eventually offered them the chance to speak. First, about the need for normalization. If you consider the norm which was designed here, you have to take into account that it's initially solely focused on this, let's say, the containment part of the value chain of non-sewerage sanitation. So there was a need here to expand the standardization process to other steps of the value chain, and particularly emptying, transportation, and valorization of fecal sludge. Those steps were not standardized, and that was one of the main focuses. The second thing that appeared as a need with regards to this norm was the need for capacity building in the sector, not only within the Ministry of Water and Sanitation, but also for all stakeholders, which are part of the ecosystem of non-sewerage sanitation. Part of that capacity building being provided through existing projects, but there was a need to go further than that. The third point made was the importance of the dissemination of existing norms, especially ISO norms. Two of them were specifically quoted, I think, the 2500 ISO norm, which are not very well known at the moment by the sanitation subsector in Senegal, and especially the main relevant stakeholders in emptying, transportation, treatment, and so on. So there needed to be dissemination and awareness raising conducted for these existing standards. Eventually, one important point is that the characteristics of the standards are integrated into the curricula of civil engineering students in order for them to actually be able to integrate those characteristics from the onset. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Romain. And thank you very much, Omar Sene. Thank you. So now I have a question for Abdulrahman Ndion. What are the particularities of the Senegal norm for containment? The DIA mentioned the ISOs, and maybe you'd like to elaborate more about the particularities for Senegal, why a norm was needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, GGGI and IWA for inviting us, and FSM Alliance for the great organization of this event. Before starting, I would like, if you allow me, to incline myself in the memory of Professor Chris Buckley from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who passed away days ago, and who was critical part of the group which developed these international standards. So I present my sincere condolences to his family, but also to the FSM community. Just like Mr. Sen was saying, in Senegal, we realized that we have a need of some specific standards. And to add some element of context on which Mr. Sen already said, Senegal was an essential part in developing some revolutionary international standards at the ISO level, which is the International Organization for Standardization. So we were administering the secretariat for the ISO PC 305 and ISO PC 318, which developed two standards on individual toilets, which we call the invented toilet, which are toilet with a treatment unit, and fecal sludge treatment unit, which can serve a community. We have adopted those standards nationally and started implementing them. And that's where we realized that we have other facilities, other type of facilities that are being largely used in Senegal and that needed regulation, that needed standardization. And that's where came up the containment facilities, which are largely called septic tank, but also as a type of more traditional toilet like VIP, pit latrine, etc. So the National Technical Committee of Senegal started thinking about developing those standards with the help of GGGI and the involvement of the ministry via the Directorate of Sanitation. We came up with a standard which is NS. NS is norm Senegalese, so it is Senegalese standards NS 17074, which is divided in 3 parts. Those 3 parts are planning and design first, and then construction, and the last part is operating and maintaining. In planning and design, we likely talk about how the soil condition, how the environment can impact the quality or the type of containment facility that is appropriate in a given area. And then for the construction part, we talk about materials that are appropriate, but also how they should be used, like how technically the construction should be done. And for operating and maintenance, we like to talk about how we do to ensure that the fecal sludge are appropriately containing, so that they will not create pollution in the environment, but also the fecal sludge is at an appropriate quality for the treatment. And the intent of this standard, if I can say, the standard pursue 2 or 3 main objectives. The first one is to allow the government through public policies, but also regulation, to sensitize the population in the need to have quality infrastructure, to have containment facilities that are compliant with the standards in order to protect themselves, their health, but also to protect the environment. The second one is to have a reference so that the operators can be trained, reinforce it, so that they know the why first, why we need facilities that are built in certain ways and how they can do it. And the third one is to reinforce the regulation, is to give a mean to the regulators so that they can assess the containment facilities that are being constructed, but also that are already existent, and make sure that the environment is safe through the operation of those facilities, but also the health of the population is protected. So those are briefly how we could present these standards, and waiting for further questions to further elaborate on those standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And in fact, there are a few questions that I wouldn't mind if ISN could actually respond to that, because I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer. So in the chat, there's a few questions on BOD and if we can download the standards. In the meantime, I have a last question for the director. So what are the next stages for implementation plan and challenges? Donc, quelles sont les prochaines étapes du plan de mise en application des normes et des défis?
Ok. Voilà, merci Nathalie. Donc, je vais revenir pour voir avec vous les éléments de, comme vous avez dit, par rapport aux prochaines étapes. Alors, la première des choses sur lesquelles nous sommes en train de réfléchir, c'est la mise en place et la mise en exécution d'un plan de renforcement des capacités des acteurs intersectoriels, tous les acteurs qui gravitent autour du secteur, notamment sur les questions relatives donc, à la normalisation. Donc, les normes que j'ai évoquées tout à l'heure, 24521 et 30500. Donc, plus maintenant la nouvelle norme sur les ouvrages d'assainissement autonome. Donc, il est important pour nous que les acteurs qui travaillent dans le secteur, mais aussi tous ceux qui gravitent autour, puissent bénéficier de sessions de renforcement des capacités. L'autre élément aussi, c'est un plan d'action de vulgarisation, parce qu'il faudrait que cette norme-là soit vulgarisée également au niveau des autorités, des institutionnels, également des leaders au niveau de Dakar, mais aussi en province, dans les régions, de sorte que les gens puissent comprendre l'esprit, mais également la faisabilité, n'est-ce pas, de cette norme. En dehors de ça aussi, de la vulgarisation, nous pensons qu'il est important aussi de réfléchir sur un projet pilote de mise en application de cette norme-là, cette nouvelle norme. Parce qu'il faudrait qu'on passe à la pratique, qu'on puisse voir quels sont les avantages, quelles sont peut-être les petites failles de cette norme, essayer d'améliorer et ensuite voir dans quelle mesure nous pouvons faire l'implémentation, de sorte que toutes les réalisations dans le secteur de l'assainissement puissent en prendre en compte les exigences de cette norme. Non seulement au niveau du sous-secteur, mais également avec les autres institutionnels qui s'occupent des questions de construction, notamment l'urbanisme, comment dirais-je encore, le cadastre et également les services des impôts et domaines. Je pense que ça, c'est un élément extrêmement important, parce que pour que cette norme-là puisse être, en tout cas, introduite dans les pratiques, il faudrait que tous ces acteurs-là, qu'on puisse aller, qu'on puisse, en tout cas, y travailler avec eux. L'autre élément aussi, étape sur lequel nous sommes aujourd'hui, c'est par rapport à la norme NS 05-061 sur les eaux usées. Cette norme-là, nous sommes en train donc d'y travailler pour que cette norme soit révisée. Donc, il y a un processus de révision de cette norme. Maintenant, pour toutes ces questions aussi, nous aurons besoin de partenariats, notamment d'appui de la part de nos partenaires, afin que nous puissions, en tout cas, y arriver. Voilà les quelques éléments que j'avais par rapport à ça. Maintenant, s'il y a des collègues, Madame Sek, qui pensent pouvoir apporter quelque chose, je pense que la parole est à vous.
Ok, je les invite aussi à partager par le chat, si possible. Pardon, j'ai coupé la parole. Allez-y.
Merci, monsieur le directeur. Merci, monsieur John. Merci à tout le monde. Je prie. Bon, concernant ce que mon directeur vient de dire, je voulais juste apporter quelques éléments de consolidation, surtout à propos de cette vulgarisation de la norme. J'ai eu à participer parce que je suis point focal au niveau du ministère concernant la réduction des risques de catastrophe. Et j'ai pu, lors de l'élaboration de la première partie du diagnostic des capacités existantes concernant tout ce qui est relatif à la réduction des risques de catastrophe dans le secteur de l'eau et de l'assainissement, j'ai intégré cette nouvelle norme, entre guillemets, cette norme déjà révisée pour alerter, qui au départ était en perspective, mais maintenant je crois que c'est une norme homologuée qui va dans le sens de la réduction des risques de catastrophe. Parce qu'il faudra peut-être signaler qu'au Sénégal, il est très rare de trouver des fosses septiques qui respectent ces normes. Ce sont des fosses généralement qui suscitent des risques de catastrophe. Mais avec l'application de cette norme-là, les risques peuvent être relégués au second plan, voire même être annihilés. Donc, c'est toujours dans ce sens de la communication et de la vulgarisation. On a eu à intégrer cette norme-là dans la stratégie nationale de la réduction des risques de catastrophe. Peut-être on aura plus le temps, lors du dernier document, d'y entrer et de développer un peu, bien sûr, cette plateforme sectorielle qui constitue, si vous voulez, le cadre même de la rédaction de la réduction des risques de catastrophe au niveau national, vraiment plus, bien sûr, dans la vulgarisation de cette stratégie, nous aider encore à vulgariser, si vous voulez, cette norme, la réduction, cette norme concernant les ouvrages non collectifs. Et encore une fois, merci. Et surtout, la partie comment aller aux toilettes, parce que si vous regardez bien, c'est cette partie-là qui est très intéressante pour moi et qui concerne généralement la population, hein, sur comment utiliser les clapets, comment utiliser, etc. Beaucoup ne le savent pas et ce sont des risques, hein, de contamination au niveau de la santé, surtout au niveau des femmes, pour les chaises anglaises, comme vous avez eu à l'appeler au niveau de la norme. Donc, encore une fois, je crois que c'est une norme qui mérite, au-delà même des acteurs principaux, des maçons et autres, mais les populations. Hein, comment, vous m'excusez, hein, comment aller aux toilettes? Beaucoup ne le savent pas. Hein, et donc, merci beaucoup. Oui?
Merci beaucoup. Hein, merci beaucoup.
Merci
en fait,
beaucoup.
on a très peu de temps et Romain, on doit aussi traduire.
D'accord, merci beaucoup. Merci
je vous remercie beaucoup de votre intervention.
Je m'excuse, merci
Romain, si vous pouvez faire court aussi, merci.
Sure, I'll try to remain short. So, the first answer about these main next steps are first the setup of a capacity building plan on all issues related to standardization, and with regards to the two standards that the Directorate of Sanitation already prepared, so the 24521 and the 3500, which are two existing standards, but also on this new non-sewerage sanitation norm. There is also the plan to set up an action plan for, let's say, a wider dissemination of the standard itself within authorities, so government authorities, but also leaders in the capital city, but also in regional capitals and dwellings, so that people can understand not only the spirit of the standard, but also that they can understand that it is feasible to implement. The third point, or the third, let's say, main step is the setup of a pilot project to help test this standard in existing conditions, study the costs and benefits for that new standard and possible gaps which are associated to its implementation. This in order for all the sanitation subsector stakeholders to see what issues and advantages there may be with applying this a new standard, and especially because for its application, there will be a need to work with other stakeholders, for instance, from other sectoral ministries in such sectors as urbanism, but also cadastre. All these actors will have to work together to ensure successful implementation. The fourth step here, and the last one, is that the Ministry of Water and Sanitation is also working on an update for a wastewater related standard, the NS 05061. And the idea is to also integrate that, I mean, part of this containment norm as part of that wastewater standard. And that's an issue for which the ministry will need additional support from development partners. In addition to what Mr. Director said, his colleague Mr. Sek added that another interesting step taken by Senegal is that they've moved on to integrate the containment norm, or sorry, the non-sewer sanitation standard into the national strategy on disaster risk management or disaster risk reduction for the water and sanitation sector. Here, the main argument was that in order to manage the risk of natural disasters, applying the standard could be part of the solution. And this also will benefit from the dissemination point of view, because as part of the dissemination of the strategy, a dissemination on the standard will also be conducted. Thank you.
So thank you for that. Absolutely fascinating to see how the sophistication of the standards are coming in. And we will come back to a panel discussion about these issues later on. I'm trying to get back to, oh, thank you. Sharing the screen for the second part of the IWA sort of involvement in this before we all come together again at the last period. Regulating CWIS, incorporating standards. I finished off the last little session from myself about the concept of a referee. A referee needs rules in order to make sure the game continues to everybody's enjoyment. And the standards, the norms are very much those rules. In thinking about CWIS, we have this real challenge of regulating both sewage and non-sewage sanitation. And the picture on the left there is from one of our case study areas, but where I've also worked, sewerage being installed in a low-income area. But the challenge of how regulators capture those costs and build it into tariffs doesn't seem to be very well picked up yet. In that particular example, $250 million put in by a donor with 0 new connections at the end of 5 years, which is a terrifying use of money, except in time it will happen, but just so much slower than expected. And on the right-hand side, an example from WhatsApp from Ghana, the clean team of container-based sanitation, one of the forms of non-sewage sanitation. How does sewerage and non-sewerage balance, and what is the job of a regulator in getting that to work? In this context, we've just made this note of how much more expensive sewerage is relative to non-sewage sanitation. 2 studies, you can always argue with studies, but the one from Kampala on the left suggesting that sewerage was more than 13 times more expensive per person per year than a fecal sludge regime. And interestingly, from Senegal, this study, it was 40 times more expensive to implement for the utility. Not only the cost challenge for regulators to think about is the willingness to pay. And so much of what we push people towards now is that user tariffs, people have to pay. A WhatsApp study in Kenya found that actual willingness to pay was only about 25% of a cost of a high quality poor flush toilet with pit latrine. And then the ongoing operational costs in a different study, but a similar proportion, only a quarter, 23% of operational costs was at the level of people's willingness to pay. And we know that most willingness to pay studies exaggerate people's willingness to pay. They always say more than is the reality. And so the case studies we have for Mugo and myself now, hoping Mugo you're coming online any moment, to discuss and to think about these issues, perhaps focusing on Kenya, then Africa, then these other case studies. Rather than giving presentations about it, we decided to have a conversation. And I like to think of it, it might be a little bit like having a cup of coffee together as we begin to address these issues. At the moment, I can't see Mugo on my system. Are you there, Mugo? Oh, you are.
My camera is on. I think I can't see you now that you're sharing the screen.
Okay. Can you put the thing so I see alongside, or I can remove this? I thought it might be useful to leave it there as a reminder of the different types of regulating we have to face. And these three sort of types of regulating we found from these case studies. Some countries are starting the CWIS regulatory transition. Some are using regulation to ensure that CWIS continues to work. And some, you could say, are completing the CWIS journey. And yes, it is a reflection of GDP per capita. I've lost you again now. We're going. But starting off the conversation, I wanted to ask you, or do you want me to stop this sharing of the screen? Is that easiest?
Possibly, yes.
To say that you've been working on these projects through WSUP, Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, for many, many years. You've been delivering things on the ground, and now this sort of aspect of regulating seems to be taking over or becoming seen by donors as even more important. Is this a new fashion? Is it worthwhile? Do you think it makes a difference?
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not just fashion. I think it's realization that something has been missing. A big piece of improving services has been missing. We come from a background whereby we have municipalities, public health departments, having taken a big chunk of sanitation service provision, especially non-sewer sanitation, and not delivered for many years. So on the other hand, we've had some progressive achievement by water utilities in providing sewerage coverage. So I think, and if you look at what service providers have achieved, regulators have played a very critical role. So I think we are all waking up to the fact that we need a similar kind of approach to progress non-sewer sanitation.
So you mentioned regulators and water service providers. Is it almost now that we are giving up on municipalities to deliver the standards that have been in their bylaws for decades, but they never ensured happened or were followed? And so we're now moving on to another actor, not just having regulators, but expecting the water and sewerage companies, as was, to take over non-sewered sanitation.
I think we gave up on municipalities a long time ago. Only that we haven't taken any action. And I think that is what we're trying to do right now. We all know, I mean, if you look at the studies, and I think you have alluded to a number of them, that, you know, in African cities, you're talking about 20, 25, 30% coverage for safe sanitation. That is extremely low. If you look at how long we have governed our services, it's been many years, and we should have been doing better with such a basic service. So where do we point the finger? We have to point the finger at those who have been having the responsibility for that long and not having done much about it.
So Interestingly, Kenya policy was to get towards 80% sewerage coverage. But is it before the regulator then stepped in and tried to help them revisit that policy to something more realistic, including non-sewered sanitation?
Yeah, I mean, all of us here, and Richard, you started as a sewerage engineer. Yeah, I don't know when you got converted. But that is a process for all of us. So initially, we've always thought that sewerage would be the solution. It's, if anything, it's the West that showed us that that is the solution. So we've been trying to follow that. And it's good that all of us are waking up to the fact that sewerage cannot serve all of us. We don't have the type of financial muscle to serve each and everyone that we need to. We don't even have the correct system to design, build, and maintain to serve people in rural areas and other places. So I think we are waking up to the fact that we have to work with what we have. We have to start from the basics. That is where even those who have 100% sewer coverage started. We have to start from there, and we have to follow that path. And I think the diagram that we showed in the presentation basically tries to show the progression of institutions in that direction. And we must wake up to that. I think that's where we are. And looking at the Kenya situation, I think the master plan, the sanitation master plan, was basically talking about sewerage, where you have a 10% going to 20% coverage, and now you want to cover everyone in urban areas by year 2030. So you plug in the gap of 80%. But the fact is, all of us, including the regulator, including the government departments, including the ministries, they've realized that it's not sewerage that is going to solve this big problem. And I think that is how we ended up with the push for 40% sewerage coverage and not 80%.
It's interesting that journey your regulator has been on, in that they had originally cut out sanitation from their KPIs of all the water companies they were looking after, then gradually went back into it again, and then enabled the ministry to change the policy to something more realistic. So it shows how regulators have to sort of evolve and the process that goes on. Nobody knows the answer from the beginning, but it's very much having a regulator to help feel the way and to explore how it might work.
Yeah, we have come from a situation whereby non-sewer sanitation was largely unowned. But we didn't quite wake up to that fact. We all assume that municipalities are doing something, they have good intention, they have resources, they could do something about it. But I think when all these, and I think we must give some credit to these global goals, because they have brought in those conversations, whether it's MDGs or SDGs, they've brought that conversation on the table of governments and decision makers. And trying to probe that, you realize that nobody actually owns non-sewer sanitation. We've always assumed that some institutions and some people are taking responsibility for that. But trying to have that conversation, you realize that actually nobody is doing anything about it. So what do? We have to start from what we have. We have to start from a system that seems to be functioning, and that is water service provision system. So regulators are the head of the table of having that debate and trying to nudge service providers, water service providers, to take responsibility for non-sewer sanitation. If we don't do that, nothing's going to happen. And I think for me, we're expecting to see something else. The moment regulators have pushed some responsibility to service providers start to say, no, you know what, we cannot be able to sustain the service. So we need some revenue, or we need some subsidy or some tax or something like that. And they start to collect money then you're going to see a fight back from those institutions where that responsibility was taken from. That's my thinking.
I was struck by the Malindi case study that was a webinar presentation a couple of months back, starting at only 1% safely managed sanitation in that city. And just what a journey they have to take. But perhaps they have the advantage, in inverted commas, of not having a sewerage base to have to fund along the way. They can really focus on non-sewered sanitation for quite a while. But to what extent do we think, because everybody's talking about subsidizing non-sewered sanitation systems, in a way, just from an add-on tariff on the water supply. But yet water supply tariffs are not yet cost reflective and sustainable either. So how do we see this working at all? Can it work? How can we cross-subsidize one service from another service when that first service isn't actually sustainable anyway from user tariffs?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, I mean, our tariff model in many countries in Africa is actually sanitation that subsidizes water supply. And we come from this context whereby water supply and sanitation have to be bundled. Mm-hmm. So you have a number of utilities in this continent that supply water. They have no sewer network, but they charge a certain percentage for sewerage. That's the irony of it. So you have a number of cities and towns where a phony sewerage charge, sanitation charge, subsidizes water supply. So the struggle now is, and I think I've seen that in a number of service provision areas, whereby you have utilities collecting maybe 75% of the water consumption bill going into sewerage, but nothing happens in sewerage. There's no investment apart from unblocking, using snakes to unblock a few things here and there, and then that kind of a thing. The stuff just flows into a wastewater treatment plant that doesn't even operate. So I think that the issue is to look at, not just look at how we're going to subsidize sanitation, but how we must improve sustainability of costs at utility level. Mm-hmm. And then that broader conversation maybe helps us find a balance between subsidizing or investing rather, because we don't even invest in sanitation, in water, in both sanitation and in water services.
So I've not noticed sewerage subsidizing water anywhere, but that's my experience. I normally find that sewerage is charged at maybe 30 to 50% of water as an add-on percentage, when the cost of sewerage operations is always 100% of the water bill. But then nothing going towards non-sewered at all. I've been struck, because you're right, I started as a sewerage engineer, and that was in the 70s in this country. And we were then sewering villages, connecting up septic tanks and putting them into a main drain. And I've recently been doing some historical research in my own area where I now live, and finding out that the sewerage scheme was finalized in this small town in 1962, when GDP per capita was about $15,000 per person. And then these things start becoming affordable. But if you map it back as to how they got there, along the way, the council was doing what we now call container-based sanitation, bucket latrines, and they were serving every house twice a week, emptying the buckets, free of charge at point of use, built into local taxation, and taking away and treating it. And this was the public service offer. But now, and that was still at $15,000 per capita on that range. But now in the poorer countries, maybe $2,000 to $5,000 per capita, we're expecting the poorest people to pay a substantial proportion of bucket latrines while subsidizing sewerage by not charging enough. Well, I find that challenging and fascinating. And what can regulators do when it's such a challenge?
I think the first thing is to all of us to admit that the rich don't pay for sanitation service. If you look at the cost of water and the percentage that comes out of that to pay for the sewer service, is not nothing. And I think the Uganda case is a good demonstration of that. So once we realize that the rich, the well-to-do, the middle income and the high income don't pay for sanitation service because it is free and it is borne through public subsidy, we start to realize that there's a serious issue of inequity. Okay, that it's an acceptable system of paying services for the rich while neglecting the poor. Regulators are about equity, they're about fairness. So, and I think that is why we need to bring regulators into this conversation. We need to step at the head of this, because it's a serious inequity, it's an oppressive kind of a system whereby we neglect those who need to be helped while helping those who don't need the help. So I think the first thing is let's first have a conversation. If you look at the willingness to pay studies and how much the poor are willing to pay for emptying the transportation cost at household level, seen that from a number of studies, it's around 20-25%. What would the rich be willing to pay? What percentage would the rich be willing to pay for investment of sewer? Okay, out of the number of thousands of dollars that are invested to serve a single household, how much would that, what percentage would that household be willing to pay for that? It could possibly be next to nothing. It could be a percentage or two. That's what they would be willing to pay. Yet the poor are willing to pay 25% of the cost of a service. So these are conversations we need to have. And the only way to make sure that everybody gets what they deserve is to start making sure that whatever is collected through sewerage levies, let it go to subsidize the poor as well. And then we start having it will be very political. It is going to be, it's going to raise a lot of acrimony. But that is a conversation that regulators need to push.
And you think regulators can do that? You think regulators have the political authority or the responsibility to deliver such a challenge? Because it almost seems to me, if there's any chance of meeting the SDG targets, and I agree the SDG standard of everybody served by 2030 is the foundational norm, regulators should ban all investment in sewerage for the next decade and put all their emphasis on non-sewage sanitation, and then ensure the revenue flows go in that direction. But do regulators have that power?
They don't have it because they have to balance interests. So you can't just focus on the poor and neglect the other segment of your customers. You must balance that interest. You must balance the interest of politicians. Politicians love sewers because it's big money. Possibly it gives something back. And toilets will not give anything back to a politician. So either way, and we've had this huge investment, public investment, to a system. If something has been put upside down and you want to correct that, you don't just flip it 180 degrees. You first let it lie down a 90 degree, and then you put it on the other side so that it can stand. So we must look at how to start reversing this skewed investment and subsidization of services slowly, and start maintaining that balance. So we also have a very huge investment that needs to be put into use. And you know that most of our investment is in trunk sewers. So people have not yet been connected. So what are we going to do with that investment? We must balance that to make sure that the economics of scale makes sense. Because I mean, you're not going to run a city with VTOs. Let's also be realistic. You know, you're not going to have, you know, thousands of VTOs and FSTPs and sludge holding tanks across the city. It's also not workable. So it's upon the regulators to try and maintain a balance to see that whatever services and systems are put in place, they cater for both categories of customers.
But do you think regulators are making that process start? The case studies I looked at, it's sort of the talk is now there, but the walk has not come yet. They're talking the talk, but not yet walking the walk in terms of actually addressing those sort of challenges.
I think one of the factors is this time. We must give this time, and we must know where. I mean, the issues are not just what we see. The issues are also what we think. When you have people who have been trained for generations and have practices that have been embedded for generations, all of us here, me and you and almost everyone else listening to this conversation, went to school and was shown how to design sewers. Okay, and now the proper containment for feces and urine is a flush toilet. So it takes all of us and then to get converted. Maybe regulators and a few practitioners and a few academicians like yourself are leading this conversation, but it's going to take root over time. So who is going to stand at the pulpit and ask people to get converted? Okay, and possibly because they have space to do that. I think regulators have a bit of space to do that because they speak to consumers, they speak to service providers, they speak to policymakers. I find their position very, very, very important.
So there is some hope.
Yeah, but maybe to ask you, because you know, we tend to theorize these things. If you look at Europe and Americas in the 50s, you know, and some other, you know, second level economies in Asia and Latin America, they were having all these problems before, and what they did is they moved to 100% to a coverage because possibly they could invest. Okay, we are not in that position as Africa. Yeah. What do you think if we were to do things differently from the way Europeans did them? What do you think if Europeans were in Africa today? What do you think they would do if they had to get 100% coverage? There are no regulations, there are no bylaws, you know, institutions are not functioning, and there isn't huge investment, capital investment for sewers and toilets and wastewater treatment plants. What do they do?
I'm intrigued by the case study I've been looking at both in this country, and also I came across it in Singapore, that bucket latrines really quite economic. And I started my career learning about pit latrines, and bucket latrines were verboten, were forbidden, because everybody knew they were smelly, dirty, and unused properly. But seeing the case study in the village I'm looking out at through my window, the transition was from pit latrines through what they called pail closets, bucket latrines, because it was much easier to empty a bucket than it was to dig out a pit. And so the deliberate transition by municipalities was to get people off what they call pit privies, pit latrines, into the buckets. And then over time, they instituted this service to be emptying the buckets to get the public health benefits, which is the reason we're in sanitation. And that went up to 50% of the population was being served by weekly, bi-weekly buckets, all paid for through taxation, not charges. And then at the same time, as wealth built up, then they began introducing the sewerage, again, over quite a long time. And yes, these are 30-year transition periods. but wow. So I'm tempted to say, because we need to finish our private conversation, as it were, shortly, and bring in everybody else. I am tempted now, as a good sewerage engineer, to say regulators should be saying no subsidies to sewerage for the next decade. All the available resources to go into container-based sanitation, like the Clean Team system in Ghana, and accepting that people will only pay 20% of it and then subsidize the other 80%. And that's the only way we might meet the SDG targets. I begin to wonder, but it's a question mark. And as we sort of open up again, my other question mark is we're not talking about grey water and stormwater at all for low income areas. We are just focused on fecal matter. And again, I'm very intrigued by the case study from my area. They put in grey water drainage and stormwater drainage. Those sewers went in very early. They went in 40 years before fecal sludge sewers. Fascinating. And that was the driver there. And why I like this history is because it was actually effective demand. So often we try and do willingness to pay surveys and what is the demand that people are prepared to pay for. And history tells us what the demand was when there was no alternative. There was no donor to come in, there was no shortcut. So anyway, grey water, stormwater, as well as these other issues have to be considered. Natalie, you should be waving at me to remind me we're going past time. Please, can we open it up? And would you like to sort of come in and bring your colleagues back on? Because we wanted to.
Sure. Yes. No, I didn't want to stop you. You're having a very interesting conversation there. The chat has actually been very active, and I'm going to thank also my Senegalese colleagues for having answered some of them. And Richard, some of them are addressed to you and Mugo as well. But yeah, I think I'm not going to read them all out for sure. I think there's some concern that we're bringing a little that's sewage a little bit too much, so networked sanitation a little bit too much into the conversation. I think people are concerned that we're bringing it too much, and in many countries it's not really an option. And also some concerns also of comparing buckets with container-based sanitation in the safety sense. Yeah, so I don't know if you'd like to answer to those, and then I'd maybe invite people to maybe put their hands up if they'd like to ask some questions whilst Richard or Mugo, you're answering those two for now.
Mugo, do you want to answer for CBS and WhatsApp experience?
Well, I'm quite at the front of the conversation around CBS from WhatsApp point of view. Clean Team in Ghana. I also work very closely with two enterprises based in Kenya, Sanaje mainly. I work a lot with Sanaje, and I'm a big proponent of CBS and the value it brings to the people and to the economy. And I think when Richard talked about the bucket latrine, it was just an analogy. That is what it was then. The sewer system of the 50s is not the sewer system of today. So the bucket latrine is to what CBS it is today. So it's not basically trying to compare that. I don't think that was the point. The point was you need solutions that are decentralized, that can be, delivered to, that can deliver safe sanitation to a household level without digging a pit latrine or constructing a sewer. Yeah. I think that's how I would respond to that. And the reason why the sewer conversation came about is because we are talking about regulations, and regulators are regulators for sewerage. That is a starting point, and we must realize that we are starting from a point of sewerage and moving backwards, and not the other way around. I think that's my response.
Okay, fantastic. Could I just ask, because also there was a question in the chat before I go to Constantina, I see her hand is up, to Mr. Endion. So there was a comment in the chat about including the private sector in some of the discussions around norms and regulations, and how you feel. I mean, I believe you're also engaging with the private sector when you develop these, but just maybe have your take on that.
Yes, and that's a good thing. You know, in the normal process of developing standards, the principle is to include all stakeholder categories. So that means the private sector is involved, just as well as the regulators, policymakers, even consumers, and academia, of course. So yeah, the private sector, and especially here in Senegal, we have sanitation, especially NSS, private sector that is very dynamic, very active, and they took a very active part in developing these standards.
Super, thank you for answering that. So maybe I think I'll also ask the Senegalese team if they have questions for IWA as well. But before that, maybe Constantina, since I see you've got your hand up, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Yes, I did enjoy the discussion. I just had a couple of comments because I somehow I felt that probably should raise them. And yeah, I still think that we're so much trapped into the framework of how things developed in Europe and how we're trying to solve solutions, some in other parts of the world where we don't have the options of trying to replicate the same solutions. So even if we think about how it was in the UK, starting from the bucket systems, pit latrines, and how it evolved with sewers, it doesn't mean that it is exactly applicable to the context of many countries in Africa. And I think probably that's the first step to try to break away from the stereotyping of the sewage systems and how we have to move even to centralized solutions, because in many of the contexts, we're speaking about decentralized solutions that are a lot more applicable. And that's why when we speak about citywide inclusive sanitation, we have a combination of the existing solutions. But to me, it feels like we kind of need to firstly break away from all the sewers and everything that we have to compare. Also, another comment I had was, I really didn't like the comparison between services for the poor and services for the rich, because I think that the sanitation is a real reflection on a lot of societal issues that we have. But I think we should aim for terms like sustainable solutions, because I really don't want to distinguish between the solutions that are offered to the different groups and castes in different societies, because whether poor or rich, I think everybody deserves to have a dignified solution. And I think most probably we have to aim to have a unified solutions, or solutions that are applicable for anyone, regardless whether they're poor or rich, but they need to be dignified and safe and accessible and relatively economically feasible. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Constantina. I'm not sure if one of the panelists would like to respond to that. And I see Stefan also has his hand up.
So first response from the panel, right? And then my point.
Yes, maybe, so that we don't lose track, if that's okay. Stefan, if you could hold on, sorry.
So I take your point. The problem is the rich, and there's this phrase from India that sewers allow the rich to excrete inconvenience. And that seems to have become the sort of a model for too many places, that the rich either have their own septic tank or they have access to a sewer, which we're not paying for, as we discussed with Mugo and myself. And we have to get out of that. And we have been seeing very much that on-site sanitation systems must be the solution. But the challenge of emptying on-site tanks or latrines in very low-income areas means people have not been able to get the human right to the dignity of good sanitation. So I confess I am having to change my mind, a bit worrying, and come back to a good quality container-based sanitation. The Clean Team program and the other examples can be seen in a World Bank document, also documented, the Sanergy ones from Kenya. Seems to me to have a real potential to ensure the human right and dignity and convenience to good sanitation. But if it could be pushed forward more as a public service rather than a private service for the richer of the poor who can afford it, then that might be a way forward. The study of Clean Team in Ghana suggests unless you get density of customers, the cost of collecting is really too high. And I've got pictures to show that Singapore, where we think of it now, was busily having a truck which went along with a team of 4 people who put the full buckets on, took the dirty buckets, gave clean buckets again to a household, and just did the whole area in a very systematic way at the cost to the public purse of the municipality. And is that the way to short circuit or to square the circle this incredible challenge we've got? Mugo, what do you think?
Yeah, for me, I think the issue of low access to sanitation is an issue of inequity. And when you're having that conversation, you must call it out. You must say what it is. The rich are getting the service, the poor are not getting the service. If you're rich and you're not getting the service, you can dig a pit latrine, you can construct a septic tank and pay that fee to an emptier. So I think we shouldn't be shy of speaking of the issues at hand. And here we are talking about regulation. Regulation is about ensuring fairness, is about ensuring sustainability of service and ensuring standards. So it's not something you can step back and say, no, you shouldn't talk about the rich and the poor, because that is how it is. That is how our public investment model is. And we need to start having that conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so I'll maybe, Stéphane, if you have your question, and then I'll also ask if Romain could maybe translate the question that was asked around services for the rich and poor, and maybe how he sees that, because Omasen is now just taken up this position, and he's giving a lot of thought to that, and Senegal is actually ahead in a lot of things for sanitation, so his insight might be useful. But maybe first, Stéphane.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much to Senegal and everyone on the stage, GGGI, for hosting this excellent debate. And my question regarding regulatory process, and thank you, Richard, for making this example of the football game and the referee and this ongoing process. I could very much relate to that. Now, here's the situation. A number of companies are trying to collect sludge and are trying to become part of the solution in order to transform the sector. But meanwhile, there are not the possibilities, not the means to convey and to comply with all the multiple regulating regimes. Now, we need to set standards, and congratulations, not only for the ISO standards, but also the national norms in Senegal. But how do we provide for a time for people to adopt their business model without the fear of being jailed because somebody finds out they're not complying? What are your experiences with that, and how do we manage and operate during this phase of transition without shying people away from the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stéphane. So I'm not sure, Florma, if you wouldn't mind asking the question to Mr. Omar Sene.
Oui, bien sûr. Monsieur le directeur de l'assainissement, donc une question pour vous qui concerne la question justement de l'inégalité de service entre les riches et les pauvres qui a été abordée lors des débats. Aujourd'hui, on a beaucoup parlé par exemple du modèle européen et je pense que tout le monde a fait le constat qu'il faut penser peut-être autrement pour les pays du continent. La question est la suivante: comment est-ce que, de votre point de vue de directeur de l'assainissement, vous pensez justement voir cette question de l'accès aux services pour tous dans ce contexte?
Merci. Je pense que c'est bon, hein?
Oui,
Voilà,
c'est bon.
Je pense que par rapport à cette question, le Sénégal est en train de l'adresser. Et en tout cas au niveau stratégique, ce qui est promu au Sénégal, c'est essayer d'aller dans le sens de la subvention, hein. Ça a toujours été le cas au Sénégal, donc pour subventionner les ménages les plus démunis à accéder donc aux services d'assainissement. Donc vous avez dans le domaine de l'assainissement urbain, il y a des branchements sociaux qui sont faits. Il y a une bonne partie est prise en charge par l'État et on laisse aux ménages d'apporter une petite contribution pour lui permettre d'accéder au réseau. Au niveau des ouvrages d'assainissement autonome aussi, il y a des projets que l'État exécute en rapport avec ses partenaires. Et là aussi, il y a une importante subvention qui est en train d'être une importante subvention qui est accordée aux ménages. Et en contrepartie, soit le ménage donne une contribution financière, soit une contribution en nature pour pouvoir avoir accès aux ouvrages d'assainissement. Maintenant, au niveau rural, il y a une nouvelle stratégie d'assainissement rural avec le sanitation marketing qui est aujourd'hui développé dans certaines zones pour permettre également aux populations d'accéder à ces ouvrages-là. Maintenant, le sanitation marketing, c'est vraiment le fait de développer une stratégie de marketing pour vendre les ouvrages. Et là, pour permettre toujours à ces ménages démunis d'accéder pour ces questions d'équité, ce que l'État a fait, c'est vraiment une subvention cachée. Donc, il y a une subvention réelle, mais le ménage n'est pas au courant qu'il y a une subvention. Ce qui fait qu'il a l'impression qu'on lui vend l'ouvrage et on lui vend ça à un prix très abordable, ce qui lui permet d'avoir accès donc, aux ouvrages. C'est cette stratégie-là qu'on est en train de développer et je pense qu'elle doit continuer parce qu'il y a une bonne partie des ménages, une bonne partie de nos populations qui n'ont pas accès encore à l'assainissement et une grande majorité de ces gens-là sont des populations démunies. Donc, pour leur permettre d'avoir accès aux services, je pense que cette subvention-là, l'appui de l'État doit pouvoir continuer.
Merci beaucoup. So, Senegal is addressing this issue already, first of all, at a strategic level, where the idea is to subsidize the most vulnerable households. An example of this is the social connections tariffs, which are in place in urban sanitation, with a large part which is, let's say, subsidized by the state and a small contribution requested from the households. Speaking specifically about non-sewerage sanitation, some projects are directly executed by the state, also with an important subsidy granted to households and a small counterparty requested from them for either a financial or an in-kind contribution from households. If you look at more rural areas, the government of Senegal has put in place its new rural sanitation strategy with a focus on sanitation marketing to help ease access. So here the focus of sanitation marketing is really a strategy to help sell the infrastructure, septics and so on and so forth. And in order to take into account equity in that strategy, the state has come up with what Mr. Director called a hidden subsidy, which means a subsidy which is not directly visible for households. So they're not aware that the product is subsidized, but that this helps decrease cost and increase access, especially from the most vulnerable ones. The point of view here is that this approach, which is, based on state intervention, needs to continue. as a large part of the Senegalese population has not access to safely managed sanitation at the moment, and that a large part of the population can be considered as being vulnerable.
Super. Thank you so much, Romain, for that excellent translation. Richard, maybe you'd like to wrap up?
So
I think we're over time here.
our time is just going past by a minute or two. So thank you very much, everybody. My personal thanks to Mugo for joining in. Our thanks to GGGI for sharing this session with us and having this overall discussion, which is fascinating. Somebody asked a question, what is IWA doing about this, assisting regulators to do this more effectively? And the IWA, through their regulatory forum, continues. The case studies we've been looking at will be published shortly, I think. And there is a webinar on June the 24th. So do look at the IWA CWIS page, and the information on the June 24th webinar will be there. But to me, this is all a process, all a discussion going on, every country having to find out its own solution and its own pragmatic balance. And I really appreciate that we can now have this regulatory process that allows us to learn by doing and has somebody to nudge us forward. And that's, to me, the great benefit of this. Natalie, your last word.
I don't want to, I don't want the organizers to run over as well. I'm sure there's other sessions on this channel as well. But thank you so much to IWA as well to kind of provide the broad context, and especially to my colleagues, GGI colleagues in Senegal, but the director, the DEA, and the DG for accompanying us. I think I'm always quite happy to put Senegal forward because I feel they've achieved a lot. So I'm happy that they also had the space to be able to demonstrate what they've done so far. Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you to all.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Merci à tous.
À tous.
Merci Richard.
À tous.
Merci Dea. Merci Abdurrahman.
Thank you, and merci beaucoup.